Hello, everyone. This is the Lesson 4 seminar, and what we're going to talk about primarily for this unit is we're going to talk about Obamacare, or the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. When this legislation was first voted on and put in effect in May of 2010, I was asked to pinch hit for somebody to go to speak to a bunch of new health administrators in New England to talk about the impact of Obamacare on rural health facilities. So at that time, there was not a lot of information in the press. So what I had to do is I had to go out there and see what was there. And there was a few things from the White House, and there were a few things from some other agencies, but basically there wasn't a whole lot else out there at that time. So to prepare for it, I actually had to read the legislation, which was 2,500 pages long. And it also included a lot of things that had absolutely nothing to do with healthcare. And I don't know how familiar you are with the way legislation and policy is done in the United States, but when something's coming up for vote, if people have some other issues that they want to get passed along with something that they think will get passed, then they'll throw those in there, even if they're unrelated, so that everything gets passed together. And that's exactly what happened with Obamacare. There was legislation for coal tar tax from lumbering, and there's a number of different things. But when it first went into effect in 2010, one of the interesting things about it is that our Congress people admitted publicly that they didn't read the whole thing before they voted on it. So when they did vote on it, at first, the press was very, very positive. It was going to make 20 million more people have health care insurance. It was going to be cheaper for everybody. There was going to be subsidies. There was going to be portability of care, that if you left one job and we went to another, you'd still have your coverage, and there was not going to be anything to worry about. So there was a lot of positive things about it. Some more positive things that came out was if you could stay on your parents' health care insurance until you hit age 26. But perhaps the best thing that it probably did was that it allowed those with chronic illness a chance to not be refused for health insurance anymore. And I'll give you an example. Back in about 2009, I had a friend that her house flooded, and she went in there she was gone when it flooded, and so it was locked up for 2 weeks after the flood. And when she went in there to check it out, there was lots of nasty things growing in there, and she went in and she didn't have a mask or a respirator on. And so what happened is she got a respiratory infection after that, and she kept going from doctor to doctor, and they kept telling her that she had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and there was no bacterial infection. They couldn't find anything wrong. Well, this went on for 2 or 3 years, and then she moved down to Texas, and I had said to her, because I used to be a microbiologist, I was like, it sounds like you have something that's infectious. I said, why don't you go see my immunologist? So she went to see her, and they did a culture for tuberculosis, a type of tuberculosis, and that is what she'd had, and that's what she'd had all along. And so, but at this point, she had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease on her chart, and she can't get anybody to take it off. So basically what that meant is she was essentially uninsurable, because that's a chronic condition that costs a lot of money, and nobody wanted to cover it. So with Obamacare, people who have conditions like that can no longer be refused coverage. So there was all of this positive press, but then some of the problems began. First off the gate, after about 2 or 3 months after it was passed, one of the main things that it did at that particular time was it cut Medicare significantly for the elderly as a way of paying for healthcare for younger people. And that was the way that the bill was primarily being funded. And that was considered not acceptable to the American public when it got out. So that part of the bill was taken off. So when that part of the bill was taken off, and even before that, the Congressional Budget Office came out and said that there was no way that it was sustainable over time, that it was going to put the country in millions, if not trillions of dollars of more debt, and that future generations were going to be paying for this generation's healthcare costs. Some of that did not get a lot of advertisement in the general press, but it was out there, and I've actually looked at the actual CBO report, and that's basically the gist of what they said. So Add to the fact that the baby boomers are the largest group in the United States history, I believe, and they're all of retirement age now. And I'm a end of the baby boomer era, Gen Xer, so we're all going to be up at retirement age within the next decade and a half. So basically, what they said is that they didn't take that into consideration, that when they cut Medicare, there was going to be so many people that have been paying into it for all these years that would need those services. So then the next thing that kind of fell was the portability of the whole thing. And it's basically what they formed instead was regional exchanges. So you could only get your health care wherever you happen to live through the particular regional exchange that you're at. If you move to a new region, then you'd have to go back to a different exchange and get the health care. Also, if you lost employment, you still lost your health care. You could seek health care from an exchange, but you still lost your health care. There was no portability there, as people thought there was going to be in the very beginning. Then when the sign-up started, several years after that, the website crashed. People weren't able to sign up. There were a lot of problems. And what's basically come to pass over the 7 years since this was passed is that now people who are out there and experience it are finding that it's very, very expensive. Several of the major insurers have pulled out, and we talked about competition last module, which has resulted in less competition. And when less competition happens, then the prices are going to go up. One insurer can absolve all the risk for that pool of people, and since the other ones have pulled out, that's pretty much what you're left, is two of them absorbing all that risk at the end. So 7 years later, people are not as positive about the Obamacare as they were initially. And I've been teaching health administration throughout this whole time, and when it first started, most of my students basically thought it was the best thing since sliced bread, to use a common term. But as time has gone on, more and more students have not really felt that way. They've experienced, or they've had their family members experience, problems with it. Some people who were working full time got their positions cut to 29 hours or less so that companies didn't have to pay health insurance. Some of the other problems is large organizations such as unions were allowed out of it. So those organizations which had a large pool of people that could have offset some of the risk for the group under Obamacare exchanges was excluded, and they didn't have to comply with the healthcare law. Other issues is Congress people themselves were not required to comply, and that irritated several American citizens, because if they required everybody else to have health insurance and to go through a certain mechanism, they thought that Congress should go through the same mechanism that they expected the people they represent to go through. And that did not happen. So there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with it. Now we've undergone an administration change, and with this administration change, there's been looks at trying to either refocus PPACA, retract it totally and completely, or to do something with it to make it more feasible over the long run. The problem is, no matter what you look at, once a certain group of people is used to a certain service or a certain thing being the way they are, or you could give somebody something, taking it back is almost impossible. One of the things that did occur under the PPACA is that the Medicaid eligibility was expanded, but that was not expanded in all states. Some states opted not to do it because they knew they really couldn't afford it. And I live in the state of Texas. We have a large Medicaid population already, and they opted not to expand it in the state of Texas because it basically would have required more money than the state had. And yes, the state does get some federal funds from Medicare, but our country was built originally as a democracy so that there was only certain things allotted to the federal government, and those are the things that were allotted in the Constitution. And healthcare doesn't happen to be one of them, which is one of the arguments of why the government shouldn't be in our healthcare, that we should let market competition take the place and function accordingly. However, the oversight of the federal government has expanded exponentially over the last 200 years. But the original premise was, if everything was allotted out to the states. If you didn't like what a certain state did, then you could pick up and move to a different state that did things the way you like it. But now with the federal government controlling so many things, that's very difficult for us as a nation to do anymore. And that's really, that safeguard has been taken away. And so that was another complaint against Obamacare at the time, is that it was too much federal power, interfering in people's lives where they didn't need to interfere, by making people pay for health insurance. If people didn't want to have health insurance, then that was their right. However, the other side of that is that if you don't have health insurance and you need emergency care, they have to care for you and somebody has to pay for that. So the rest of the citizens are paying for it. So what is the answer? I don't think anybody really knows what the answer is. The answer, perhaps in my mind, when Obamacare was first passed, was to do a market competition-based exchanges, where all the federal government did was oversee the exchanges to keep the prices down. I think that might have worked a lot better than a whole piece of national legislation, but I could be wrong. And there was a lot of people that felt that way at the time. But what we have right now is sort of a big monster that is adding to our debt. Although our national debt has gone down a little bit in the last year, it's still going to add significant costs in the future. And what you'll hear quite often from people is our children and our grandchildren are going to be paying our debt. And that, in many ways, is the case. And if you take the money away from Medicare, then you are basically killing, quote unquote, the elderly to take care of younger citizens, and that's not considered ethically acceptable as well. So it's a very significant ethical dilemma that we've gotten ourselves in as a country. And one of the arguments you always hear is, well, they do it in other countries, so why can't we do it? Well, number one, they do it in other countries. They don't have even close to the population that we have. Germany does it, Britain does it. They have about the population of the state of Texas or less. And that's only one state out of 50 in the United States. Then you'll hear people say Canada does it. Yes, Canada is very big geographically, but they don't have that many people. So again, they don't have to fund that many people. And if you look at the countries that had total universal care in the past, Great Britain, Australia, China, what they have done is they have gone back and have enacted an additional private system in addition to the public system, because the public system just was not cutting it because people couldn't get in for care. Canada, you've probably heard about people from Canada coming over across the border to get health care in the United States. That happened quite frequently as well when they couldn't get services because they had to wait too long in Canada. So although it's worked in other countries, we have to consider the scale that it's trying to occur on in our country, which is causing a lot of the problems that have occurred with Obamacare. So is it all bad? No. I mean, I think it's great that college students don't have to get a separate insurance policy anymore. That was very difficult. It's great that people with chronic diseases can't be denied for insurance anymore, but that being said, even though they can't be denied, their premiums are still exorbitantly high. So nothing much has changed on that realm. So as you do your research this week, I really want you to think about what some of the pros and cons are, because no legislation is totally good or totally bad. There's always good and bad parts about each. So I want you to get a feel for what the PPACA is really about factually, not what the media says, not what you heard from your mother or your brother or your aunt or your uncle, to actually look out there at the sources that are factual and see what it's all about. So I hope you all have a good week. Goodbye.